Charles's received English, you know, is closer to the BBC voice of Dylan in his broadcasting prime. Dylan didn't sound like a boy from Swansea when he was on the BBC because he was paid to sound like a BBC person. Remember, we're talking about the 40s, 30s, 40s and 50s, when the newsreaders on the radio wore dinner jackets. On the radio wore dinner jackets. That was the BBC. So Dylan had to sound very BBC. And Prince Charles, of course, sounds, that's the received English. So Charlie made a pretty good fist of it. Also, and I don't say this in Britain, one of my close collaborators now in terms of poetry is a Welsh language poet called Graham Davies. And Graham is the personal private secretary to Prince Charles now since the last 2 years. And he assures me that Charles chose to, he wasn't given Fernhill, he chose Fernhill. And you think, why would Prince Charles read Fernhill? Well, the poem addresses several of Prince Charles's personal agendas. Green issues, spiritual revelation through nature, and the celebration of creatures on the farm and in the wild. It was his choice. He could have read anything. The prince that year also visited 5 Cwmdonkin Drive, as well as the boathouse. And he was patron of the 2014 Dylan celebrations. Dylan, the prince of the apple towns, would have been tickled. On the wall above the door to my study, and in fact in our kind host's house in New Haven, is this astonishing lithograph by Kerry Richards. I've got a framed and a double-sided copy. This is The Force That Through the Green Fuse Drives the Flower, one of the great poems of the 20th century. It's the centre spread from Poetry London, Volume 3, Number 2, 1945. It's probably Kerry Richards' first public response to Dylan's poetry. See? Double-sided. That I walk under on the way to my study. It marks my place and keeps me in my place. If one could only write as well as that. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age. You can access Dylan reading that on your phone. All of these things are there somewhere in the clouds. But get the box set of CDs. Absolutely wonderful. It's very sad and sexy. All right? Astonishing. After the Kerry Richards retrospective at the Glynvivian Gallery in Swansea in 2003, Margaret and I went for a meal afterwards in the Slow Boat Chinese restaurant on High Street with Richard Burns, the critic, and Dylan's daughter, Aronwy Thomas. Aronwy was charming, while Richard Burns, released from his efforts at the exhibition, drank steadily and, as always, was erudite and garrulous. It takes some company for me not to get a word in edgeways, but by go. The previous year, I met Richard Burns off the London train at Cardiff for a poetry reading at my university, and we had coffee in a quiet cafe in the Morgan Arcade in Cardiff. We talked of the research he'd done for his fascinating book on Kerry Richards. Kerry Richards and Dylan Thomas, Keys to Transformation. It's a bit heavy, but essential reading. At one point, Richard seemed to gaze fixedly over my shoulder into the sky. I'm pressing him a bit hard after his long journey from Cambridge, I thought. Then he returned his gaze on me and began to speak. It was a coffee table, right? Began to speak, not recite, speak. Fernhill, the whole poem, celebrating the words, every one of them. He just knew it off by heart. wish I could. I can't even remember my own poems. Dylan Thomas is important because, not because of the drinking and the, the faculty wives and over here, but because he wrote at least six of the greatest poems of the 20th century, of the greatest poems in the English language. He also wrote some hugely entertaining stories, and the best radio play ever written, Under Milk Wood. It should never be performed. Sorry, I'm sorry. It's a radio play, so again, listen to it. Stone Black, Richard Burton.
What's the name of it? What's the name of the radio show?
The radio play was Under Milk Wood.
Under Milk.
Milk Wood was the wood underneath Larne. You don't know that? Or you're going to remember it, just that. Under Milk Wood is the greatest radio play ever written. Sorry, there's no argument. That's a Ronwy, sadly now died. She was charming. Dylan's 4 kids had a hell of a time of it, But because he had patrons, the kids were all privately educated and were not there to witness the fights between Caitlin Thomas and Dylan. Caitlin could drink Dylan under the table and had a stronger right hook than he ever had. Here again is Kerry Richards. You see the heron. The heron is holding a kind of flower, hanging basket, which is also a skull. Out of death comes renewal, comes life. Kerry Richards and Dylan Thomas both were celebrating that fact. Here is the book that Richard Burns edited, because Kerry, when he heard that Dylan was dying, this was before the internet and everything, but people in Britain knew. Dylan took about 3 or 4 days to die in that New York hospital, never recovered consciousness. But Kerry went out and bought, he owned the collected poems by Dylan Thomas. He bought 3 others, and he drew on them. Not illustrated, he illuminated them like a medieval manuscript. And this is the best of the drawings from those 4 books which Richard Burns has put together. It's a lovely book. If you can get that online as well. I can give you all these details later. I'll email you. But that's a lovely facsimile to have. And it helps you explain to yourself and to students the poems. The illuminations, show the essence of the poems as well. There's Dylan Thomas. No, it isn't. I only ever attended one Dylan Thomas poetry reading, for in his performance of Return, Journey and other works, the actor Bob Kingdom became Thomas. In the Sherman Theatre in Cardiff in 1990, when we saw the show, you did not even have to close your eyes to believe that it was Thomas. For Kingdom's body and that of the later bloated and bulb-nosed poet merged into one, and the voice was perfect Swansea BBC, perfect for the 1953 American tours. Some 20 years later, just a couple of years back, I was invited to the Dylan Thomas house in Swansea to contribute to a recording about Dylan and his work for an iPod production. I didn't even know what an iPod was. I still don't. But anyway, I did that. And around the scullery table were the biographer of Thomas, Andrew Lycett, the actor and Richard Burton's nephew, Guy Masterton, and Bob Kingdom. After we'd done our stuff, I cornered Bob in that little front room, and I gushed at him like a fan, which is what I am. Time waits for no man, sizzled poet or aging actor, but for decades on stages around the world, lauded by people like Eric Clapton, no less. At very special moments, the lamented dead poet and the talented actor seem to occupy the same moment on the same stage. If Bob Kingdom brings his Dylan Thomas show anywhere within 100 miles of you, just go. Right? In 2012 and 2013, I reworked and extended a one-act play which I had written on the Tenby-born painter Nina Hamnet. I worked that into a full-length play, 3 monologues really, comprising monologues by Nina Hamnet, Gwen John, and Augustus John. As Augustus, Gwen, and Nina, this received 2 amateur, though skilled, I must say, performances at the Barry Arts Festival and then in the Tenby Arts Festival in 2013, prior to their undoubted West End and Broadway run. I'm open to offers. In the plays, I have Nina and Augustus referring to Dylan. Gwen John never met him and would surely have crossed herself and said 3 Hail Marys if she had. If you're not familiar with Gwen John, Augustus' sister, and if you're not familiar with any of those names, then see me afterwards. Gwen John was the lover of Rodin. She is now recognized as one of the major women painters of the 20th century. Augustus John, who was world famous before the First World War, who showed in, they both showed in the Armory show in New York, which changed the whole direction of American art in 1913. Augustus John has fallen out of favor, so much so that I could buy a rather nice drawing, which was affordable last year. But Gwen's star has gone up and his has gone down. So, back to my play. Augustus, tired and painted out in his studio in the mid-1950s, says, "Oh, to have died a young genius, J.D. Innes, Dylan the syphilitic cherub, Dylan the poor pugilist who punched me in command because I tumbled his wench, Caitlin McNamara, buxom Irish girl, what a dancer she was." Nina, the Queen of Bohemia, and you may not have heard of her, more than surviving in the gloom and pleasures of the London Blitz, where, let me tell you, anything went. She says in my play, "We Welsh sticks together in a big city, don't we? Nina, Augustus, Dylan Thomas. Young Dylan's got himself a cosy number in the war business. Hush, hush. I'm the Welsh secret weapon against Adolf," says he. Says he'll try and get me apart. "I'm a museum piece," says I. "I'll dust you off," says he, "and make an exhibition of you." Nina seemed to have forgiven Dylan for his uncomplimentary review of her autobiography, Laughing Torso, in the Western Mail in 1933. Nina Hamnet, Augustus John, and Dylan Thomas, in the war years in London and afterwards, brushed and bobbed and drifted together as part of the flotsam of Fitzrovia, the Bohemian area next to Soho. Louis MacNeice, the poet, George Orwell, the boys from the BBC, the great painters Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud, the 2 most important painters of the century. Julian McLaren Ross, the novelist Colin McGuinness, the blind, almost drunk, almost poets, and John Heath Stubbs, who really was blind and really was a poet. Nina Hamnet didn't wear too well, did she? She was the lover of Henri Gaudier-Bresca before the First World War. One of the great early sculptors of the 20th century. Nina was born here, in Lexden Terrace, the grandest of 18th century locations in Tenby, one of the grandest in Wales, with views of Corley Island and the Gower Peninsula from all 5 floors, even the toilet. We have a friend who lives 2 doors along, in that end one here. Oh, I've got a pointer, haven't I? There, our friend lives there. This is one of the great places in the world to live. We have a friend who lives there 2 doors along from where Nina's commemorative blue plaque is. And it was in her house, in Marion's house, that the honeymoon scenes of the 2008 Dylan Thomas film, The Edge of Love, bloody awful film. It was in her room that the honeymoon scenes were shot. Sienna Miller and Matthew Rhys as Caitlin and Dylan spent idyllic hours in this hotel in 1937 in Cornwall at the beginning of what would prove to be tempestuous marriage. The money shot was of the pair sitting on an upholstered window seat, you know, looking out. This is St. Catherine's Rock, looking out to Collie Islands out here somewhere, a holy island. The film had the pair of them sitting on an upholstered window seat before the stunning view. Except there was no window seat at Lexington Terrace, so the film company built one. Oh, don't worry, darling, we'll take it away afterwards. Put everything back as it was. Oh, no, please leave it there, said our friend. And very comfy it is, too. Andrew Lycett, in his biography, remember I was with Lycett in Dylan's house, Andrew Lycett, in his biography of the poet, reports the following conversation. This is Augustus, as you see in Caitlin. Augustus John to Dylan Thomas. All you are is a pot-bellied purveyor of pornographic poetry. And Dylan to Augustus. And you, Gus, you are a bearded begetter of bastards. It was said, we don't have to tell you how virile Welshmen are. You know, no question. It is said that when he walked through Soho, Augustus John would press a shilling, what a guinea, a shilling into the hand of any child he saw, in case it was his. Augustus John, who lived to hear the Beatles' first hit, he didn't die till 61, was, I mean, was so famous, hugely famous. They were going to give him a knight, this is not, I'm off scripture, they were going to give him a knighthood, right? Right at the end. And they got to the point of actually giving him a knighthood, and they discovered that he wasn't married to his common law wife, so they gave him an Order of Merit instead, which is also very grand. But she said, I'm not marrying him after all these years, so he didn't get the knighthood. Here's a man who should have got a knighthood, but he did, just before he died, get a CBE, which is the next thing to one. This is our very dear friend and wonderful writer, Danny Absey. Danny died just a couple of years back. And this is a photograph of us together. Are you familiar with Danny Absey? Right? Jewish Cardiff family. His brother Leo Absey, famous MP. His other brother Wilfred, an eminent psychoanalyst here in the States. Anyway, in recent years we've taken to meeting our old friend and my poetry mentor, Danny Absey, for lunch at the Mondello, an Italian family joint in Goodge Street, near to Fitzrovia, round the corner from the famous Bertarelli's restaurant, frequented by Dylan and everybody else. There are many stories and memories from Danny, that most remarkable of Welsh writers, who lived into his 90th year. Danny remembers alighting from a bus in Swiss Cottage and encountering Nina Hamlet. Remember Nina, the derelict, the astonishing beauty who became an old bag lady? He remembers alighting from a bus in Swiss Cottage and encountering Nina Hamlet on the pavement, trying to touch up passers-by for a handout. Buy me a drink, dearie, my fucking cat is dead. It cost him £half a crown, just over £2 bob. She swigged down her gin and tonic and left Danny alone in the pub with his desultory half-pint. Shortly after Dylan's death, Danny wrote an elegy for him, a wonderful poem. Look up in surprise, in a hurt public house or in a rain-blown street, and see how no fat ghost, but a quotation cries. You know, celebrate the words, not the legend. And once the young doctor, Danny Absey, met Dylan Thomas in a pub, of course. As in awe of Dylan, and as I would be later of Vernon Watkins, Danny was pretty tongue-tied. But he mentioned his Swansea cousin, the painter Leo Solomon. Dylan must have known this contemporary, surely, but he offered no response. When Danny Absey left, "Goodbye, Mr. Thomas," he said. "Goodbye, Mr. Solomon," Dylan replied. One of the many guests I invited to my creative writing master's course at the University of Glamorgan, was a friend of Danny Apsey's, the eminent New York poet Stanley Moss. Decades before, as a young poet working in publishing in New York, Stanley was familiar with Dylan Thomas's work and reputation. Recognizing him in a bar, of course, you can see the theme running through this, in Greenwich Village, he struck up a conversation. Dylan confided that he drank simply because I don't do anything really useful. Dylan spent time in Stanley's apartment, and once in a taxi with Stanley as audience, Dylan did a fine impression of God receiving T.S. Eliot into heaven. Oh, I wish somebody recorded that. Dylan could be a dangerous drunk, but also a very entertaining drunk. In 1953, Stanley mourned the loss of his Welsh poet friend, and his poem goes, "In this pit, the word is my bread. I pass the word and let the others know." Now, Stanley Moss had also known Dr. Fentelstein, who clearly indicated to him, Stanley, that he had in fact given Dylan an injection of morphine. Most medics and biographers now agree that it was the drug that killed Dylan, not the drink. Also in that year, Alessandro Contini Bonacossi died. He was an art collector who had some of the finest examples of old master paintings in private hands. Stanley Moss, urbane, witty, and a fine linguist, became the art dealer and agent who placed those old masters, works by Goya, Tiepolo, Zurbrand, and Piero della Francesca, in some of the world's great public art collections. In the New Yorker, back in September last year, Stanley published a new poem in his 88th year to heaven, 60 years after Dylan's death. What a remarkable man. Stanley Moss. I was hoping to meet him when we were over here. I couldn't make contact. I mean, he's in his 90th year and he doesn't live in New York City anymore. Now, I've been a guest writer at Tembe Arts Club several times over the years. What is always mentioned in Tembe is the fact that it was their arts club in early October 1953 that Dylan first read from and performed much of the final version of Under Milk Wood, just before his last fateful trip to America. My old deputy headmaster at Green Hill School in Tembe, Bill Davis, was there and assured me that this was the case. So was the poet Raymond Garlick, whose poem commemorating the evening I included in my 1989 anthology, The Poetry of Pembrokeshire. This is what Raymond said. "The scene was set for speech, and nervously he stirred and spoke, shuffling the pack of papers on his knee. At random, drew one, stared, and woke into awareness. It was October, the month of birthdays. The saga was nearly ended," because of course in November Dylan died. What is also remembered is that Dylan Thomas spent so long in the Coach and Horses in Upper Frog Street, the oldest public house within the town walls, that they had trouble getting him home. A sign outside the pub, as you see, now claims that the poet left his copy of Under Milk Wood there and had to rush back from Tembe Station to retrieve it before flying off to America. The publisher and BBC producer, Douglas Cleverden, remember I showed him in the studio with Dylan? Douglas Cleverden records that the following week in London, Dylan again lost the script, this time at a Soho pub. Luckily, Cleverden had arranged for his secretary at the BBC to run off stenciled copies. This is before Xerox even, remember? She typed out stenciled copies. 3 of them Dylan had with him for the flight to New York, so there was a chance he'd actually turn up with one of them. After completing 2 readings in New York and having added another page to the play's ending, Dylan collapsed, was taken to hospital on November 5th, and died 4 days later. In the art version of this talk, I go on to show the death mask. 2 young New York sculptors David Slifka, who died a few years ago, and Abraham Lassaw, took the plaster of Paris in and did a death mask of Dylan. And it's a very strange thing. There's one copy in the National Museum in Cardiff, there's one copy in the BBC in Cardiff as well, and to my shame, I don't know where the others are, there must be one in America, there's got to be one in one of the major American collections. But what an odd thing to do. That is an indication of how famous this guy was when he died. I mean, he really was, before the media age, he was a kind of media star. Every time Margaret and I drive down to our house in Pembrokeshire, we stop in Carmarthen, the place of my birth, and park in a large car park where my junior school used to be. My parents had pulled some strings to get me into that school. I should have gone to the model school just down the road where my father and uncle had gone, where Dylan Thomas's father, D.J. Thomas, had been taught before his successful entry to the University of Aberystwyth. Dylan's father always felt that he should have been given a university job. He was head of English in Swansea Grammar School, famously of course, but always felt that he hadn't got his just desserts. From the top floor of the car park where we park, I can see the council house in Penderfynon Street, in the back garden, where I was born. Next door but one, and also a few doors further along, were two families of coracle fishermen. One called the Thomas Dool, the Water Thomases. They would have been the background characters in Dylan Thomas's wonderful short story, A Visit to Grandpa's. You've got to read that. A Visit to Grandpa's. Dylan's grandpa was asked, because he disappeared from the village, and they found him on Carmarthen Bridge. Dylan's grandpa was asked, "And what do you think you're doing on Carmarthen Bridge in the middle of the afternoon with your best waistcoat and your old hat?" Grandpa did not answer, but inclined his face to the river wind so that his beard was set dancing and wagging as though he talked, and watched the coracle men move like turtles on the shore. "I'm going to thank our dog to be buried." And he watched the coracle shells slip into the water lightly, and the gulls complain over the fish-filled water. "There's no sense in lying dead in Llansteffan." Dylan Thomas is a great short story writer. And as you can tell, they're much easier than the poems, much more accessible. One fine autumn day in 1995, we attended a brief ceremony of the interment of Glyn Jones' ashes in the Church of St. Stephen in Llansteffan on that Towy estuary. Glyn was a marvellous poet and novelist. I highly recommend him to you. A marvellous poet and novelist, a deeply serious man with an irrepressible twinkling humour. He saw every sense in lying dead in Llansteffan, and he was smiling over us that day, I'm sure. I'd known Glyn for some years. He'd helped me polish off my Writers of Wales book on Danny Absey. I visited Glyn many times at his home in Cardiff. He had books signed by Dylan, including a copy of 18 poems, the very first book, which Dylan had given him in London on its publication in 1934. God, what's that worth now? And a correspondence with Dylan over a number of years. Glyn was a principled Christian gentleman who had declared himself a pacifist at the beginning of the Second World War, and was sacked from his teaching post and suffered considerable hardship for his principles. When he was too old to be conscripted anyway, he needn't have said anything. He could have kept his head down for the duration. Meanwhile, Dylan had frantically pulled every string and almost exhausted his wit in avoiding conscription. The army would eventually dismiss him as unfit in any case. Glyn first met Dylan in 1934, after writing to him a letter of admiration for two poems he'd read in the Adelphi magazine. Dylan was almost 10 years younger than the young Cardiff schoolmaster. Glyn later described him as, quote, angelic and tremendously endearing, wearing a black polo-necked sweater and a pair